When I say the word ignorance, what kind of feelings are conjured up? What image, if any, is brought to your mind? We're told ignorance can be something enviable. Ignorance is bliss, as they say. It's an age old adage that we're all familiar with, and there can be some truth to the saying. Certain types of ignorance can be harmless, helpful even, but dismissing ignorance in such a way is an easy way to soft pedal and rationalize what can actually become a dangerously slippery slope. Regardless of your personal emotions associated with the concept itself, the truth is that ignorance isn't inherently good, nor is it inherently bad. Formal study of ignorance, or agnotology, has only found its footing within the last couple of decades. Yet, in that time, many have contemplated both the origins and the uses of ignorance in our society at large. Generally speaking, ignorance can be seen simply as a lacking of information or knowledge in a given area. It is only when you begin to look at the origins of that ignorance that the moral permissibility of the concept begins to change. If you're listening to or watching this speech, you're likely enrolled in a higher education institution, in which case, by seeking out and participating in academia, you're already establishing foundational skills in the prevention of ignorance and its future spread. While varying degrees of ignorance may exist for a litany of different reasons, we have a responsibility to keep ourselves as informed as possible, if nothing else than to avoid future ignorance-based harm, and therefore, no form of ignorance can be justified from a moral standpoint. In order to fully understand the consequences that arise from ignorance and its popularity, it is important to first look at its origins and how it gains that popularity in the first place. In their foundational text on the subject published in 2008, entitled Agnotology, the Making and Unmaking of Ignorance, Stanford University professors Dr. Robert Proctor and Dr. Londa Scheibinger propose looking at ignorance in a bit more of a nuanced light. Rather than thinking of it as a sort of monolith, they instead encourage identifying ignorance through three distinct lenses: that of implicit, unintentional ignorance, or what they refer to as native state ignorance, ignorance as an omnipresent force, something that individuals are subject to and participate in, either wittingly or not, or lost realm ignorance, and lastly, ignorance as a deliberate action or maintained state, or strategic ploy ignorance. With lost realm ignorance, Proctor notes that even the sourcing of information can be seen as being a double-edged sword. That, quote, "The decision to focus on this is therefore invariably a choice to ignore that." This can be unintended, or, as is the case with strategic ploy ignorance, a deliberate action with the intention of keeping individuals, arguably yourself included, in the dark. It is these latter two concepts that have the most duplicitous of connotations, and even while the idea of native state ignorance is typically seen as innocent in nature, it too can lead some to be more susceptible to the more explicitly harmful forms of ignorance at the end of the day. The elephant in the room when we talk about this intentional ignorance is that it inherently comes from a place of self-preservation. That is, one is in a position where they are privileged enough to actively avoid gaining information about a relevant topic or area in order to avoid feeling a cognitive dissonance or a challenging of one's existing beliefs. In a 2011 article for the American Psychological Association's Journal of Personality and Social Psychology titled "On the Perpetuation of Ignorance, System Dependence, System Justification, and the Motivated Avoidance of Socio-Political Information," Dr. Stephen Shepard of Oklahoma State University and Dr. Aaron Kay of Duke University find that when individuals feel they lack knowledge on a given issue, they defaulted to a mediating force, in this case the government, to maintain the status quo, and in fact actively avoided seeking out further negative information in relation to the issue that might better inform them. It is much easier to simply not possess any knowledge in a specific area than it is to challenge yourself and actively seek out new information. We can see examples of ignorance in many aspects of our lives and society today. The constant drum of television and radio personalities emphasizing culture wars and spewing false or inflammatory comments and opinions to a wide audience. The parasocial relationships and the manufactured authenticity encouraged by social media platforms that compels users to trust the information that they see without much critical thought, actively aiding in the spread of misinformation without any consequence. Political parties, even worldwide, adopting and normalizing ignorant rhetoric at the behest of a few and demonizing those who stand in opposition to them, just to name a few. While these things may seem like passing extremes to some, collectively they play a much larger role in shaping the mindsets of some individuals, occasionally to the point that those individuals then may carry out acts of violence against other members of society. Within the past few years, we've seen an increase in terrorist acts that are carried out over explicitly false and or ignorant beliefs. As noted by journalist Hannah Gaze in a 2022 piece for the Southern Poverty Law Center's Hate Watch journal titled Far-Right Extremism and Gun Violence, Reimagining Prevention, as well as by journalists Adi Cohen and Benjamin Decker in a 2022 piece titled Internet Trolls Should Not Dictate the Terms of Public Exposure to Hate, for the nonprofit startup Tech Policy Press, the perpetrators in the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand in 2019, the El Paso, Texas shooting in 2019, as well as in the Buffalo, New York shooting just earlier this year, explicitly noted their beliefs in the unfounded Great Replacement theory, a far-right white supremacist conspiracy theory, as part of their rationale for their actions. Additionally, all three published manifestos prior to the attacks across various social media platforms and online message boards, with all but the El Paso shooter even live streaming the massacres as they happened. While terrorist attacks like these are uncommon in the grand scheme of things, and may even seem like a distant or unlikely possibility, they are rising in frequency at a rate that is not completely insignificant. As hopeless as these actions may make some situations feel, there are ways to go about curbing the spread of ignorance in all of its forms, and our society would most certainly be better because of them. The most obvious solution to a lack of knowledge is simply to gain said knowledge one is lacking, right? While it would be naive of us to assume a broader access to or overall higher level of education amongst the population would cure all of society's ills, as morality and ethics are not universal, a society that is better informed would have less susceptibility to misinformation and conspiracy. Media literacy skills are especially important in the digital age, as Dr. Reem Al-Zubi of Al-Abayet University highlights in a 2022 article for the University of Rhode Island's Journal of Media Literacy Education preprints titled The Impact of Media and Information Literacy on Students' Acquisition of the Skills Needed to Detect Fake News. His report finds that university students who were subjected to a course on media and information literacy developed skills that led them to be more critical of the media in which they were consuming, better able to recognize misinformation when presented with it, and better able to distinguish between fact and opinion. The importance of efforts to reduce the prevalence of ignorance and lessen radicalization isn't simply limited to the education sector, however. Dr. Kartika Bhatia, researcher for Aspire India, and Dr. Hafez Ghanem, former vice president of the World Bank, find in a 2017 report for the Brookings Institution entitled How Do Education and Unemployment Affect Support for Violent Extremism? Evidence from 8 Arab countries, that, quote, unemployed/underemployed educated individuals are more likely to support violent extremism, with unemployed secondary educated people having the highest probability for radicalization, followed by tertiary educated unemployed/underemployed individuals. Dissatisfaction with one's economic or occupational prospects is not simply limited to those without higher educational attainment, and a better national economic environment can potentially result in a reduction of an individual's susceptibility to emotion-based and inflammatory rhetoric. What we are left with here then is an image of a society, of a world even, with greater economic prospects for its population and higher levels of academic attainment overall, two primary drivers of innovation. When you think of a society that emphasizes education and knowledgeability, what does that look like to you? It could be a society that is more accepting and more understanding than anything we've seen before. It could be a society where emotion-driven rhetoric and beliefs are disincentivized for their visceral nature, where instead individuals approach the world with an open and critical mind. Imagine for a moment a country that is more productive, possesses better health outcomes for its citizens, pays higher average incomes, and has lower rates of crime and violence. A country where civic engagement and community formation is greater, and our democracy is almost surely stronger as a result. If we allow ignorance to become the norm, we could be facing an epidemic of hate, violence, inequality, and stagnation far greater than what we see today. In a world where an intentional avoidance of knowledge is sought, vitriol is allowed to spread unchecked. People are accustomed to acting primarily out of emotional impulse, and possession of knowledge is ridiculed. With these ideas in your mind, I strongly urge you to act upon them and to re-examine the way you think about ignorance in your day-to-day lives. One of the first things I encourage you to do going forward is to actively recognize and subsequently dispel ignorant rhetoric and thought. As uncomfortable as it may be, sometimes the most immediate and effective action is simply to explicitly oppose ignorance when you see or hear it, and make it known that it often has much more profound impacts than simply being a passing statement here or there. Advocacy for educational reform and expansion is another way that you can approach combating ignorant beliefs in a hands-on way. Joining advocacy groups or contacting your local elected officials to make your desires known are some of the most effective ways to spread a belief system to a wider audience. These ideas are only that, ideas. However, the possibilities for what good could come from a widespread adoption of an anti-ignorant mindset are truly limitless. We've already played witness to some of the uglier effects of ignorance, yet as you leave here today, I wish to remind you of your power to combat such impacts in the future. As you've seen, as popular and attractive as remaining in a state of ignorance may be to some, it is imperative that we actively oppose its existence. The gaining of insight can, in theory, mean the difference between life and death sometimes. While varying degrees of ignorance may exist for a plethora of reasons, we have a responsibility to keep ourselves as informed as possible in order to avoid future harm from ignorance in all of its forms, and therefore, no form of ignorance can be justified from a moral standpoint. Instead of allowing apathy to dictate your stance on ignorant thought, championing education expansion and actively combating the spread and influence of ignorant rhetoric would have a much more significant impact on our society at large. If we change how we think and feel about ignorance, we recognize that remaining critical in thought and open to new mindsets is paramount to maintaining an ever-improving society. Thank you.